Why don't you tell me about your mother? Now, there have been many different kinds of personality theories over the history of psychology that have been very popular. A personality theory, you can just think of that as a system of concepts, assumptions, ideas, or principles that we use to explain personality. As I mentioned in the previous video, the modern way that we tend to talk about personality is in terms of traits. So the trait theories are currently the dominant kinds of theories. These trait theories are just attempts to kind of like quantify the different aspects of personality, assign various kinds of personality different numbers, and based on those numbers we can know more about you. But if we just look a little bit into the past, we'll see that other theories, non-trait theories, were extremely popular as well. Like one of the first major kind of personality theories were Freud's psychodynamic theories of personality, which focus on the inner workings of personality, especially like internal conflicts and struggles and the unconscious mind. But there's also, behavioristic and social learning theories. This is just all coming back to observational learning, which we talked about in a previous video. Now we're focusing much more so on the environment, on, experience and learning and things like that. And then there's also some humanistic theories, and I haven't really touched on these very much. These focus more so on private, subjective, like personal opinions and personal experiences and things like that. So we'll talk about each one of these in a little bit of detail. Like I said, one of the first real popular set of ideas to help us understand human personality was proposed by Sigmund Freud. So he developed, psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory. Remember, Freud never did any science. He just would talk to his clients, take lots of notes, and then compare those notes to his other clients and start looking for, some underlying, themes or some underlying correlations. And based on those themes that he noticed, he developed these theories. So they are definitely based on something, they're just not based on scientific evidence. And whenever Freud talked about personality, he used the term psyche. And Freud argued that the psyche is composed of three parts. You have the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, the id, you can think of the id as the most immature part of your personality. It's kind of like the most primitive part of your personality. It's almost entirely in your unconscious mind, and what it does is it energizes you, it motivates you to engage in various behaviors, and operates on what we call the pleasure principle. Now, the pleasure principle just refers to the irrational nature of the id. The id just wants things. It doesn't care about the consequence. It doesn't care about the reality. The id just demands like immediate gratification. Now, the id is definitely self-serving and irrational, and it's something that we're all born with. I mean, if you look at a very young baby, that baby is just a little ball of id. The baby doesn't care that you haven't slept. The baby doesn't care that you don't have any milk ready, like you'd have to go make it if the baby is going to be fed. The baby doesn't care about any of that. The baby just wants. They're just little balls of want, and that's what the id basically is. The ego is something that develops as the child gets older. In the first few years of the child's life, they'll begin to develop their ego. And their ego is a more executive part. It's the part of the personality that deals with reality. It deals with, finding practical solutions to the id's problems. So the ego operates on what we call the reality principle, where it will either delay action until it's more practical or appropriate, or it will try to find ways to satisfy the id that are more efficient and effective. And the ego is something we're partially conscious of, but it's also partially an unconscious thing as well. Then that third part, the superego, this is developed much later. So we're talking like late childhood to even, young adulthood even. The superego you can think of as like a judge or a censor for your thoughts and actions. Superego is developed from interactions with your caregivers, parents, and like role models. Whenever these individuals that you look up to, whenever they reward you for engaging in various behaviors, that's going to help build your ego ideal. So those behaviors that they reward you for, you're going to think of those behaviors as good things that you should strive to do in the future. So, just the things you were rewarded for in the past are the kinds of things that you're going to think are good to do in the future. Then the other part of the superego is the conscience. And the conscience refers to those things that you've done in the past that you were punished for and you try to avoid in the future. So these three different personalities, these three different aspects of your personality are constantly interacting. The id decides that, we need something. And then the ego is basically trying to calm the id down and say, hey, look, I know you want that thing, but we can't get it right now. It's just not here. So you need to try to relax. And the ego is pretty good at doing that. And then you can think of the superego as being kind of removed from the situation and just kind of looking down on both the id and the ego and deciding whether or not, you should stop this whole process or whether we should allow it to continue. When this process isn't functioning right, it could result in what Freud called neurotic anxiety or moral anxiety. Neurotic anxiety is when the id kind of overpowers the ego. The ego just can't handle the id anymore because the id is just making, very serious demands. It's getting very kind of loud in this argument, if you want to think of it that way. So the ego can't really control the id, and a person who has neurotic anxiety will likely do things that are completely irrational, impulsive, and selfish. The other kind of anxiety I mentioned is moral anxiety, and with this, now we have a superego that is way too powerful, a superego that's just looking down on this process, and whenever it notices anything it doesn't like, it just shuts it down. So the superego is constantly shutting down the id and the ego. And the consequence of that is that a person with moral anxiety pretty much never has fun. They never satisfy their id's impulses. They never feel pleasure. They're just kind of depressed people. Another major contribution that Freud provided for personality theory is how personality develops. So I mentioned that the id, ego, and superego develop as you get older, but Freud articulated this development in terms of stages. So the very first stage we go through is the oral stage. That's when you're between the ages of like 0 to 1. And the reason why we call it the oral stage is because children at this age are mostly interested in stimulating their mouth. They want to eat. They want to put things in the mouth. If you know a child this age, you know how annoying it can be when they just stick everything they can grab in their mouth, especially things that are probably not too good to chew on. And what Freud would argue is that if children suffer from some kind of developmental problem, like if they're overfed or frustrated or they have some kind of mouth-related issue, they could develop a personality disorder when they get older. The two kinds of personalities that they could develop would be either oral dependent, where they're more gullible, passive, and seeking attention, or oral aggressive, where they're more likely to argue and exploit other people. The second stage is the anal stage, and that's when a child is basically learning to use the potty, between the ages of about 1 and 3. The reason why we call it the anal stage should be pretty obvious. The child is learning how to control their poops, to put it simply. They're paying attention to and they're getting pleasure from either, correctly using the toilet or by being, stubborn and refusing to use the toilet. And if a child has too harsh or too lenient potty training during this stage, the child could develop, one of two kinds of personalities. I'm sure you've heard of anal personality, but that's actually not precise enough. There's two kinds of anal personality. The kind that you tend to think of when you call somebody anal is anal retentive. So that just means that the person is stubborn, stingy, orderly, and compulsively clean. It's like, just think of the word anal retentive. That means they never want to poop. They never want to cause a mess. They never want to make a problem that they would have to fix. But the other kind of anal is anal expulsive. And that sounds gross, but the image it evokes definitely explains this kind of personality. So somebody who's anal expulsive is literally, crapping everywhere. They're messy. They're just throwing their junk all over the place. They're destructive and sometimes cruel. Third stage would be the phallic stage, and this is when the child is between the ages of about 3 to 6. We call it the phallic stage because this is when children first start to really recognize differences between the two sexes, and they get pleasure from exploring those differences. This is when children will start to show a level of attraction to somebody of the opposite sex, or in some cases the same sex. But if a child has a developmental problem during this stage, they could develop a phallic personality where they're vain, exhibitionistic, and narcissistic. This is also the stage where Freud would argue that boys will experience an Oedipal conflict and girls will experience the corresponding Electra conflict. So the Oedipus conflict or the Oedipal conflict is something that we see in boys, in this age, where they appear to feel like they're competing with the father for the mother's attention. So the young boy feels like a rivalry for the mother's attention, the mother's love. The boy feels threatened by the father. We call this fear of the father castration anxiety, because the young boy, he recognizes the father as being a superior example of manhood. It's like the young boy realizes he pales in comparison to the manliness of his father. So he feels like he's basically been castrated. In order to resolve this kind of anxiety, in order to resolve castration anxiety, the young boy has to, change his focus from the mother's love to identifying with and becoming more like the father. And Freud would say that this also involves adopting the father's heterosexual beliefs. Remember, Freud was not a scientist. And in doing this, and identifying with the father and adopting the father's beliefs, then the boy will be able to develop a conscience. Now, before I go to the Electra conflict, I just want to make it very, very clear. I've already said this many times, but Freud was not a scientist. Many of these ideas were just straight out of his observations with his clients, and as a result, most of this stuff doesn't hold up. Like, we have actually tried to verify some of Freud's theories using scientific procedures. They just don't hold up anymore. So it's interesting to talk about these things, but I wouldn't put too much, faith into what Freud thought about pretty much any aspect of psychology. That being said, let's talk about the Electra conflict, which is just like the Oedipus conflict, except now we're talking about young girls. So girls between the ages of about 3 to 6 will feel love and affection for their father and a kind of competition with the mother. But Freud argued that the girl has more, compared to the boy, the girl has a much more difficult time dealing with this kind of conflict, because the girl, while she'll be able to identify with the mother, she'll do so much more slowly because she's already been castrated. She doesn't have a penis. Freud literally argued that because girls don't have penises, they have a harder time developing their personality during this stage. And the consequence of that is that the young girls are not as capable of forming, a fully developed conscience. Then we move to the next stage, the latency stage. And Freud really wasn't interested in the latency stage. This is basically everything from the age of 6 to right up to puberty. And the reason Freud wasn't interested in it is because nothing really seems to happen here. The child just kind of forms same-sex relationships and likes to play and explore and do all the kid stuff, right? It isn't until the genital stage that we see a big, major change in personality. The genital stage, which starts approximately at puberty, that's when real, sexual interest awakens. And that's when, people's personality is going to basically be fully developed. So here I have all the different stages in a chart. So just to review, during infancy, 0 to 1 years of age, that's the oral stage. And then young childhood, ages 1 to 3, when you're potty training, that's the anal stage. And then childhood, about 3 to 6, that's the phallic stage. And then the preteen years, from 6 to 12, that's the latency stage. And then everything past puberty would be the genital stage. So modern science definitely has discredited much of what Freud argued. Much of Freud's theories have been kind of thrown away, but we still talk about them because they are kind of interesting, and they do seem to have, a little bit going on. Freud wasn't completely wrong, perhaps, about everything, so that's why we still talk about it. But even back in Freud's day, Freud's apprentices, Freud's underlings, whatever you want to call them, the more technical term is neo-Freudians. A lot of these neo-Freudians didn't agree with him either. So they weren't scientists, but they also kind of thought Freud overemphasized sexuality. To Freud, everything about personality was related to sex, and they just kind of downplayed that in their own theories. So now I just wanted to mention a couple of these theories provided by neo-Freudians. So one particularly famous neo-Freudian is Alfred Adler, who strongly disagreed with Freud's emphasis on sexuality. He thought that people's personalities are developed not by a drive to be sexual in some way, but by this kind of striving for superiority. So people wanted to become better. People wanted to maximize their potential, be the best person they could be. And in doing this, we tend to recognize parts of our personality that are flawed, things that we cannot perfect, things that no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to overcome. And Adler argued that the way we get over that is through compensation. So because we can't fix this one problem with our personality, instead we'll kind of try to redirect attention towards in the opposite direction. My favorite example of this is if you've ever seen the movie Shrek. Lord Farquaad is this tiny, tiny little person, and he's got this massive, massive castle. Clearly, his tininess is being compensated by building extremely large castle. Another relatively famous neo-Freudian is Karen Horney. And she, being a woman, argued, obviously, that there isn't such a big difference between the genders. She argued that, Freud's idea that anatomy determines your personality to a large part, boys are going to be fundamentally different from girls, she just thoroughly rejected that. She said that instead, we're all kind of dealing with a basic level of anxiety. So we all deal with anxiety that just occurs from living in a hostile world. Things aren't handed to us in a silver platter. Sometimes we have to fight for the things that we need to survive. And how we do that, how we go about, solving our problems in this, sometimes scary world, will help to shape our personalities. And she's one of the first people to talk about 3 different kinds of personalities, where she called these the modes of interacting, where you either work with other people to solve your problems. So that would be working towards people, being pro-social. You work away from other people, so that would be asocial. You just want to do it on your own. Or you work against other people when it comes to solving your problems. So now you're what we would call like anti-social. So asocial, antisocial, and prosocial are the three basic kinds of personalities. But by far the most popular Neo-Freudian, the most well-known Neo-Freudian is Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung made a lot of really interesting contributions to our understanding of personality, but I'm just going to mention a few. One thing that he talked a lot about is the persona. That's just an aspect of our personality. That's the part that we portray to others. So that's like a mask that we create, the way we want other people to perceive us. And he also talked a lot about the difference between like Freud's unconscious mind, which he called the personal unconscious, and something that he developed called the collective unconscious. So the way that the collective unconscious differentiates from the personal is the collective unconscious is a part of the personal that is, you can think of it as a storehouse for images, ideas, and feelings that everyone has. So while it's definitely a part of your unconsciousness, it's something that we all share. Now, I don't want you to get all like metaphysical or spiritual about this. I'm not saying that there's some, mythical substance that we all tap into so that we can share these ideas. It's not like a hive mind or something like that. It's just, these are like ideas that we're born with. You can think of them as being written into your genes. And that's most likely how the collective unconscious works. It's just ideas that are literally encoded into our genes. Now, these ideas in the collective unconscious are called archetypes. So an archetype, that's just a universal idea, image, or pattern that we'll see being repeated across all cultures. So you'll know it's an archetype if you see it in all the different world cultures. And we do see similar kinds of ideas worldwide. Here's just a few. Worldwide, we have the anima and the animus. These are archetypes representing femininity and masculinity. Then there's like a self archetype, that's usually a symbol that represents unity, completion, or balance. A very common way we portray that is by some kind of mandala. A mandala is just a circular design that represents balance, unity, or completion. So the most obvious example of this would be a Tao symbol, like the yin-yang symbol. So you see symbols like that everywhere. Some other kinds of archetypes, like there's event archetypes. All world cultures understand events like birth and death, separation from the parents, initiation, marriage, the union of opposites. And figural archetypes, like character archetypes, like mother, father, like a devil or a villain or a god or a goddess, a wise old man, trickster, hero, maiden, many more. These are just some of the most, mainstream ones, and by far the most easily understood ones, the most universal of all these archetypes would be mother, wise old man, and maiden. And then there's motif archetypes, where these are just various kinds of more vague ideas about things like the apocalypse, or a deluge, or the creation. So pretty much every world culture has ideas regarding, how the world's going to end, this idea of some kind of major flood, and how the world was created. It'd be very strange if you found some culture that doesn't have clear ideas about these kinds of things. So if we all have these ideas, if we all have these archetypes in our heads, it allows us to more easily understand things and share various kinds of ideas. And the really interesting thing about archetypes is that if you create characters, if you create a story that fits these archetypes very well, in general, that story will be very compelling to a wide audience. Obviously, if you write a story using these characters that are universal, that everybody understands, then it's just naturally going to be understood by a wider audience, and it will likely be a very popular story. And that's exactly what we see when we look at some of the more popular and famous, fiction, especially in the movies. So if you look at a movie like Star Wars, I'm talking about the original trilogy, not the new garbage. When you look at the original trilogy of Star Wars, one of the very first scenes of episode 4 is we see Luke come out and look at the sky. As soon as you see Luke, as soon as you notice that character, you automatically, instantly know who he is, what he's capable of, and what he's likely to do. Even if you've never seen the movie, he's clearly the hero of this movie, and that means he's going to do X, Y, and Z. Those are things that we just know and we expect. Same goes for Darth Vader. Darth Vader is pretty much the very first character we see in Star Wars, and as soon as you see him, you don't need to see anything he's done, you don't need to hear his voice. As soon as you see him, you see that's the bad guy. It's obvious. So that's enough about Freud. Now I just wanted to talk a little bit about humanism, the humanistic movement, which was founded by Carl Rogers. Now humanism focuses on things that make humanity special, like unique human experiences and problems and potentials. So Carl Rogers talked a lot about different kinds of basic humanistic principles that I'll go into more detail in just a moment. But another major humanist was Abraham Maslow, who developed something called the hierarchy of needs. And he also did a lot of research into self-actualization, and we'll talk more about that later. But some of the basic ideas of humanism was that people have free choice. We have the ability to decide our fates, and because of that, we need to accept the responsibility that comes with that. All I'm saying is, if you're in a place that you don't like, if you're unhappy with your life, according to humanism, what you should do is just look at the decisions you've made that brought you to this point and accept the responsibility for those decisions. Only by accepting that kind of responsibility will you be able to move on. Like, if you're always just kind of passing the blame to somebody else, you'll never really be able to, maximize your potential and become a better person. Humanism also talked a lot about human nature. Like, everybody has their own opinions about what humans are like, but it was the humanists that first really started talking about these universal qualities that people have, patterns of behavior that most people will show. But they also talked a lot, and there was a big emphasis on the things that make us unique. So each individual has their own unique, perspective. We all have our own frame of reference. So the world that I live in, my reality, is fundamentally different from yours. Everybody has a unique outlook. But as I mentioned before, one of the perhaps most major ideas that's come out of humanism is this idea of self-actualization. And that's just, you can think of self-actualization as the realization of your full potential. It's becoming the best person that you could possibly be. It's the expression of your creativity. It's sometimes like a quest for enlightenment, pursuit of knowledge, desire to give back to society. People who are self-actualized can be identified because these are usually highly achieving individuals. And here's that hierarchy of needs I mentioned earlier. So Abraham Maslow, a humanist, just articulated that we have these different kinds of needs. So this is definitely something we've already talked about a little bit, so I'm not going to go into detail, but the whole idea here is, before you can even begin to self-actualize, you need to first satisfy your most basic needs, like your physiological needs, like food and water, and your safety needs, so just feeling comfortable, feeling secure, and then your love and belonging needs, feeling like you have friends and family and a support network. Your esteem needs, just feeling like you're a good person and you've done great things. So it's only after satisfying these 4 basic kinds of needs will we ever be able to, maximize our potential through self-actualization. There's other theories out there as well regarding personality. These are like social learning theory, for example, behavioral learning theories. These are just theories that argue that the way we develop our personality is through things like classical conditioning and operant conditioning and observational learning and things like that. So we imitate, we identify with other people, and we imitate much of their behavior. Now, the people that we tend to imitate are people that we identify with. Now, you don't just identify with random people. You tend to only identify with people that you have a deep, kind of stable emotional connection to. So this is why children tend to imitate their parents. They feel deeply connected with their parents and their caregivers or whatever. And because of that admiration, because of that emotional connection, they're very likely to copy them. All I'm saying is, I think it's funny because quite often I'll notice that my son copies my behavior. But if you were to come over to my house and do some strange behavior, you don't need to worry about my son copying your behavior because he doesn't really know you. So there's not much to worry about in that regard. But I definitely need to be careful about what I do around him, because far too often I've caught him doing something that he clearly learned from me and I'm not too happy about. And sometimes my wife gets me in trouble for it. But the very last thing I wanted to say regarding personality is just about biology. I mentioned earlier that archetypes, these are things that appear to be like written into our genes. Well, you might ask a more general question. Is personality written into our genes? And that's exactly what a lot of researchers have looked into. Just, is there a genetic component? And when we talk about like a genetic component to personality, the term we use is temperament. So temperament refers to those hereditary, genetic aspects. And whenever you do this kind of research, what you're doing is called behavioral genetics. And to make a long story short, we've done a whole lot of research, and what we've found is that by doing twin studies, where we just look at personality differences between identical twins raised apart or raised together, what we tend to see is, regardless of whether they're raised apart or together, they have a very, extremely, remarkably similar personality. So there's clearly a genetic component, a strong genetic component to your personality.